In this interview, I'm joined by Beth Upton, meditation teacher, ex-nun, and student of the renowned meditation master Pa Auk Sayadaw. Beth reveals why reading economics at Cambridge caused her to fracture with today's economic system and eventually led to her ordination as a nun in Myanmar. Beth details her rigorous training under renowned meditation master Pa Auk Sayadaw, addresses skepticism of the Visuddhimagga, and criticises so-called soft Jhana teachings as watered-down Dharma. Beth contrasts popular soft Jhana teachings with how she was trained at Pa Auk, discusses the 10-fetter model of enlightenment, and explains how samadhi can be used to remember past lives and generate Siddhi, such as the ability to see devas and ghosts. So without further ado, Beth Upton. Beth Upton, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, likewise. I'm very delighted to be talking with you today. And gosh, you've had a very interesting life, an interesting life path. And I'd like to dive into some of those details. But before we get into your encounter with meditation, I'm wondering, could you say a little bit about your childhood and upbringing? I know you were born in 1982 in London, so your website says. And so I'm curious about your upbringing and how it was you came to study economics at Cambridge University and things of that nature.
Yeah, very normal upbringing, I think. Like I grew up in Harrow, which is like an outer London borough. So sort of suburban, working class, normal family, dukkha. I don't have too much to say about it, not too much drama there. And then I did well at school, so I sort of had like a real hunger for knowledge and wanting to find out about how the world works. And I had done a lot of like maths and sciences. And then at some point I sort of hit a limit with science because I was just feeling like it didn't explain the human element enough. And somewhere in my naivety, I thought that economics might give that rigorous, in-depth answer to the human condition. So I chose that for my degree, and then I was wrong. They just taught me a lot about money. Yeah.
I'm curious which college you studied at, and maybe you could say a little bit more about your time at Cambridge to study economics.
So I was at Robinson College in Cambridge, and I mean, that place gave me a lot. I don't want to speak too bad about Cambridge. It gave me a confidence, and it taught me how to be very productive. I met a lot of incredible people. There was a lot of privilege there. But it wasn't a happy time of my life. It's a lot of pressure. I wasn't particularly interested in the subject that I was studying. I was heartbroken for a big chunk of my time there. And so what I really came out of that 3 years with was an understanding that like I didn't want to be an investment banker. And yeah, like I really got it hammered into me, the trouble at the heart of money. So from there I started to seek a different way. I didn't really know quite what I was looking for, but I just wanted to seek a different way.
Well, that's very intriguing. And what would you say is the trouble at the heart of money that you discovered and that you felt was hammered into at that time?
It's a few things. I think one is money is inherently distorting value. It's something that's very central. So we've got like in this sort of economic ideals, the price of something is just a reflection of its supply and its demand, and like, great, there you get the price. And actually what we have is like a heavily distorted supply, which is like distorted by people's defilements, and then a heavily distorted demand, which is distorted by things like lies and manipulation and advertising and things like that. So the prices of things become a gross distortion of their true value. And then also we see with economics the tendency to overvalue things that are quantifiable because they can be included in the model, and things that are difficult to quantify like our mental health and the environment and love and happiness and these things that we really value, those things are just external to the model. And so they get completely undervalued by economic thinking. So, I mean, there are two really central problems. Their view of the human being is like very stripped back from any kind of humanity. Anyway, I could go on about it forever, but like loads of just really core things that felt off to me. And I was seeing like, wow, the world is built on these assumptions. So much of our lives is revolving around these really distorted, weird assumptions that we've made about how life works. And I didn't want to base my life on that.
That's interesting that you would include the defilements. I suppose you wouldn't have seen it in quite those terms at that time. I'm imagining, I don't know, Rolex, a distorted supply, maybe producing less than they could, strict authorized dealer controls, things of that nature to increase the desirability, I suppose.
Yeah, and then a massively distorted demand. Like they've managed to convince people that they need this watch.
Right. And the reasons people want the watch are, I suppose, fairly diverse, but telling the time, surely it's not top of the list.
Right. And like we can see it in all sorts of choices that we make. So when I was a nun for 10 years, and there, after a while, you stop to think about your food in monetary terms. Your food's offered to you, eat what you're given. And if we're going to place any sort of a value on the food, if we're going to prefer one meal over another, usually we're tapped into the intention of the donor. And if we see like a beautiful, loving intention of the donor, we appreciate the meal more. That's the flow that we're in. We might make choices about what we eat based on what feels good for our body, if we're lucky enough to have choice as a monastic. But since I disrobed and you go to the supermarket, you look at the price. Your ideals might tell you to look at, oh, okay, I'll buy the chocolate that where they treated their workers the best and they put the most love in. But realistically, you look at the price and everything else is external to the model. And so we distort where our true values are for our own well-being and the well-being of others because of the economic system that we're in.
I'm curious about, perhaps that's something for later, but maybe I'll say something about it now. I'm curious about, of course, as a monastic, you, as you say, as you report, think less and less about money and monetary value and tune into things like the donation, the intention or a motivation of the donor. Presumably the donor, in order for the monastic to have that possibility, the donor has to be plugged into some sort of, I suppose,
faith in the Dharma.
But in order to acquire the resources to donate, they themselves have to be concerned with the value of things and money and so on, and through their faith.
Yeah, with the monetary economy, it's one of the reasons why I disrobed. So, and there were lots of reasons that I made that decision, but I noticed that last couple of years of my ordained life, I was already sort of over it. You know, like I'd done it for 8 years. I'd very much ordained because I was in love with the meditation practice, and then I'd learned the training that they were teaching in the monastery. And the thing that kept me ordained was I really don't want to have to use money again. Like, I just really don't want to have to do that. I was in such a beautiful flow of living by gift, and I just thought, oh no. At the same time, I was growing a community in Spain that was dependent on the money that we were getting from other people. And there was a judgment in me. There was an aversion to it. And so I just, like, this is what I need to go and do. So I did. I just got a job, went and did care work for the minimum wage. It was good for me. And the problem is systemic, you know, and that's a big, big sacrifice that those Burmese lay people make. And they do it out of love for the Dharma.
Where are you now at with this, I suppose, conundrum that began in your economic studies in Cambridge and continued, I suppose, for better or worse, through your monastic period? And now you're, as you say, out of that. You're no longer a nun. What's your current thinking on that in terms of money and how it fits with you personally and how it fits. You're talking systemically, and do you have thoughts, system-wide thoughts, etc. also?
Yes, I'm trying to find a middle way, and I definitely don't have it perfect, but I'm doing all of my work by Dharma, which means I never charge a price for my work. I essentially give it away, and I allow people to give whatever they feel is right in return. It works really well for me. So on the side of, actually, I would say it's one of the most beautiful things in my life at the moment is this living and working by Dharma. And that works really well for me, and it sits really well with my ethics on the side of receiving money. And I still haven't figured out yet the bit about spending money, because so many things that we need when we do that spend, we've like legitimized some distortion of values in that moment of the spend. And so it's something that I'm still trying to figure out. In my sort of medium term vision is the building of community where we can meet more of our needs in a wholesome way. But for the time being, I'm just trying to find like a middle way with it.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. So I think it's an unusual jumping off point. People talk about suffering, or people talk about curiosity about mystical states and so on. That's an interesting fracture with the path you were on, to do with fundamentally the heart of economics. It's very interesting indeed. Mm-hmm.
It's not separate. It's not separate. Like when we start to, so an increasing part of my work as well is communities or systems that were previously money-based, moving them towards Dharma-based. And what we see is when we start to move towards a gift-based system, a Dharma-based system, many other aspects of Dharma flood in. So community immediately starts to flood in. For example, renunciation starts to flood in. When we're renounced, there's humility there, faith arises, and love and trust and connection starts to flood in. So many other aspects of the Dharma start to flourish when we move towards a Dharma-based system.
Oh, very fascinating. Do you think such communities, that way of operating, could ever be anything other than, if you want, an island in the broader ocean of the economic system, a sort of separate island within the broader? I'm thinking, for example, of money as it's often described as an efficient means of transfer of value, that sort of an idea. And I just understand that that's not necessarily, that's a rather simplistic view of how money's understood and used today. But there's something about the efficiency. I may not have a sheep to give you for your, basket right now, but I had one previously, and I have some money left, from that, which I can use as a means of transfer and so on. So I'm curious, do you think at a level of complexity, societally or systemically, money becomes, or some form of currency becomes inevitable?
Yes. Yeah. As a means, as a transferring system, yes, but that's not the function that money's currently doing in our economy. When money's created by debt, there's always more debt than money. To keep the money system going, we need to be increasingly commodifying more and more and more of what previously used to be commons. It used to be open source for everybody, but we all feel poor in the current monetary system. And so there's always the need to like grab something that previously wasn't in the money realm and turn it into a source of money. We all end up collectively poorer by that, because there's less in the commons for us to share and feel safe. There's less in the realm of community. We see that now, even unfortunately, starting to happen with the Dharma. I've heard stories, like, I'm new to Dharma in America, but I've heard people have started to claim intellectual property over their Dharma talks. This Dharma that's been handed down to us as commons 2,500 years. Now we're like, have that bit, I'll charge some money for it. So this is what our current monetary system is doing. It's not just a transfer of wealth. If money were neutral like that in our current financial system, then we would flow in the gift much more naturally. But we don't. At the moment, there's an incentive when you have money to hold on to it, because money grows money. It's not just a transfer of wealth, it's a creator of increased wealth.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting indeed. So you're still in the process of thinking through exactly how you're how you're going to exist within this sort of this system and how communities could work. As you said, very interesting indeed. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's working well for me on the side of receiving, like doing my work by Dharma and how I earn my money. I feel really good about. I mean, I'm not rich, but it was an experiment and I wasn't sure if I'd be able to survive just full-time teaching Dharma just by gift. And now I see I can survive, not with financial privilege at all, but I can survive, and that's huge.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's just a case of scaling that up.
It certainly helps, I think, being in America as you are now, teaching quite a lot compared to UK. I think there perhaps the market, or you're frowning, maybe not. The market...
It's much more difficult in America.
Really? Tell me.
Yeah, it's much more difficult in America because it's the home of capitalism, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the point. Then there's a lot more people who are willing to give you money for teaching, right?
It's just much more normalized to charge money for teaching here.
Oh, I see.
It's much more normalized to commodify things here.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
So you went traveling for some years after leaving Cambridge, and then ended up volunteering at a Tibetan center, meditation center. And that was your first.
You know that? Did I tell you that?
No, I do a bit of research for these things. Have I been stalking you? Not at all. I've been researching you a bit. It's only polite, I think, when you're interviewing somebody to do a bit of research.
Yeah, that's true. I did do that.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that and how it was you went from there to Myanmar.
Yeah, so it was a little bit roundabout. I mean, so I left, and like I said, I was just knew I had to find a different way. I worked in London for about a year or something just to get a little bit of money together, and then I just had to get out. And that was around the time when I went to the Shetlands, just like that young need in me to get out. So I didn't know where I was going or what I was doing. I just wanted to look for something else. And I did a bunch of things. I did some volunteering, some organic farming, au pairing, all of these things that you could do at that time. And just as part of that, I ended up at this little Buddhist center. And, it was they had a Lama there from Tibet visiting, and he spoke about the Four Noble Truths. He spoke about compassion. It just felt like what I'd been waiting to hear or something. It really hit me deeply. It was like, oh, yes, thank you. Finally, somebody's speaking the truth to me. And so I knew it was something that I needed to give more attention to. But also I wasn't yet done with exploring the world and seeing what was out there. So it took me another couple of years before I finally settled down and ordained.
I'd like to ask you, of course, quite a bit about your ordained life, where you studied under the master Pa Auk Sayadaw, a very, very renowned meditation master, notoriously rigorous, actually. And in fact, the meditations that you teach and you've described in your YouTube channel, which of course I'll link in the show notes below, really remarkable, deep meditations from that tradition that you've explored. Something does come to mind. Did you have any religious orientation growing up? For example, did you come from any kind of religious context?
No, I went to the brownies and the Girl Guides, and then it was only afterwards I was like, they were religious. They kind of sneak it in. And I was like, oh, that's what they were about. No, religion wasn't a big flavor in my upbringing.
Yeah, those are like the Girl Scouts in the UK.
Yeah.
Also, we had those in Scotland. Yeah, very funny. Okay, so you didn't have that. That's very interesting. You ordained in 2008.
Yeah.
And you were a nun for 10 years.
Yeah. 5
of which were spent quite directly under Pa Auk Sayadaw and his senior teachers.
Yeah.
And the other 5 training in various other methods, which I'd like to ask you about. I'm curious if you do you remember the first time you met Pa Auk Sayadaw? Perhaps you could say a little about who he is. I think most listeners will perhaps have heard the name. Could you say a bit about who he is? And you've got a very lovely video on your YouTube channel interviewing him. Great video. Could you say a little bit about Pa Auk Sayadaw and do you remember the first time you met him?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, he wasn't there when I arrived at Pa Auk, and he wasn't there when I ordained. At that time, I was learning from Bante Uravata, who is a phenomenal teacher. Phenomenal. He's, I think, one of the greatest teachers in the world. Um, then I'd been there about a year and a half, and Pa Auk Sayadaw had been away teaching in other places, and he came back to lead a 6-month retreat. So the first time I saw him was we had all gathered because it was like Pa Auk Sayadaw was coming back to the monastery. So we had all gathered in the hall, and they had like lined the road to offer him things and stuff. And I was just sitting there in the hall. I was very junior. And he just walked in and he sat down and he said a few words. And it was the first time in my life I'd really felt like my body has no choice but to bow down. Like just compelled with respect towards the wisdom that he was holding. And then on that 6-month retreat, I got to know him very well because I was interviewing with him every day and sometimes twice a day. And we developed a really close teacher-student relationship that carried through the rest of my time at Pa Auk. To describe him is really difficult. I mean, he is like the ultimate Dharma geek, like he cares about these tiny little detailed corners of the Dharma like no one I've ever met before. He knows, like sometimes you ask him a question and not only he knows the sutta, he knows the commentary and the sub-commentary and the page number and the footnote, just like off the top of his head. Got like this huge intellect alongside this really deep samadhi. Yeah, I think in the Dharma world today, there's very, very few people with that depth of knowledge and depth of practice.
How do you think he came upon that sort of knowledge? You're talking there about deep knowledge of the texts and the doctrines. He's also very renowned and perhaps more famous, at least in America and Europe, due to some of his students writing books and so on, I think, perhaps. He's also a renowned meditation master, not just a scholar in that sense. So how do you think he came upon all this depth of both doctrinal knowledge, scriptural knowledge, as well as meditative accomplishment?
Yeah, he put the hours in. I guess he did. I don't think we can explain it all from this life. Not someone with that depth of practice. He's got a really, really deep reverence for the Visuddhimagga, and I think a lot of people, if they ever read that book, when they read it scholarly. And he read it and he was like, I'm going to check if this is true with my own direct knowledge. And he went and did it. Went and practiced his way through the Visuddhimagga. And it brought back to life in the world practices that were previously, pretty much extinct because they weren't alive in the hearts and minds of the practitioners. And he's just taught a whole new generation of meditators how to directly observe these things. It's incredible gift to the Dharma from one man.
And you yourself were initiated into many of these practices. It's sometimes said, and I think you'll have heard this, some people, of course, very pro the Visuddhimagga, some anti the Visuddhimagga, right? There's these sorts of debates. I'm not so concerned with the scholarly debate in this instance, but some things people say about the Visuddhimagga is, it's not possible what's in the Visuddhimagga. It comes from, I've heard this view, it comes from the Buddha taught something different originally, and the Visuddhimagga is, it has these Vedic influences, or it's sort of competition and mythologizing of attainments and practices. Some of these meditations are just so outlandish and so on, it can't be done. It's unreasonably high. Have you heard that view, first of all?
I've heard the view about lots of things, that it's not possible anymore and it's unreasonably high. And I think that there's like a monastery of thousands of people doing it is like argument enough, right? Like we don't really need to say anymore. It is possible. And I think one of the most destructive things these days to people's practice is that expectation of failure, that view that it's not possible anymore. Is one of the core messages that I'm trying to give as a teacher is like, my good, like if I can do it, you can do it. These things are possible. These deep teachings are fragile in the world. They're not easy to find, but they are still here, and we preserve them through putting them into practice. Like, come on, chop, chop, let's do it. Yeah.
Amazing. And one of the things I've heard you speak quite directly to is jhana. This distinction that is sometimes heard between hard and soft jhana. I've heard you speak to that distinction as perhaps a polite way of giving people who haven't had jhanas.
I'm sometimes not very polite about it.
No, you don't have to be polite here. But anyway, you've more or less said that, perhaps to be more direct, that soft jhana isn't really jhana. What people think they're having down that end of jhana isn't really the real thing. And perhaps allowing that term soft jhana as a sort of polite concession, but that real jhana is something else. I'm wondering, that's something that Pa Auk Sayadaw is very famous for, actually, his rigorous jhana standards. And in fact, the whole path of concentration that he teaches, with its very many diverse and interesting meditation techniques, rigorous. He's not a soft jhana man. Let's put it that way. Could you speak to that a bit, and perhaps your own experience?
First of all, I want to say he's not the only one, right? Like, there's several teachers in the world that have been teaching really deep samadhi, not even only in the Buddhist tradition, but in many traditions. And it's only recently that there's been any kind of controversy over what is samadhi. Like, we've got great teachers, Deepa Ma and Ajahn Brahman, many teachers who are, they might have slightly different ways of getting there, but they're pretty unanimous on what constitutes samadhi. And Pa Auk Sayadaw is in agreement with them. And this thing about, like soft jhana or whatever, I see it as part of a bigger trend of, I don't want to sound harsh, but the term that comes to mind is like dumbing down, watering down the Dharma. And it seems to me like it's for economic reasons. It's to get bums on the seats. It's to get people through the door. It's like, feel good. You can do it like that. Now, like, the practices that are being taught when people teach like soft jhana, they're not harmful practices. It's lovely to feel joy in your body. A lot of people feel benefit from it. The mind is wholesome. Like, great, do that. But don't call it what it's not, because when we misuse vocabulary like that, we directly threaten the continuation of the real one in the world. And I think sometimes those teachers, those people of influence, don't realize the damage that they're doing to the continuation of the depth of the Dharma in the world. So maybe mostly a vocabulary problem, partly an economic problem. When we start to value, but there's a stage of meditation that we all get to that's frustrating, where all of our worldly conditioning is activated and we think like, I'm not getting anywhere. Am I good enough? This is frustrating. Our craving comes up. I want to go deeper. I need to feel like I'm making progress. I'm putting in all of this time. Nothing's changing. It's an uncomfortable stage of the practice, but it's so rich in the Dharma. When we deal with that state with skill, we put down loads of self and craving and clinging and these things that are keeping us in samsara. And when we try to make that stage of meditation more comfortable by saying, oh, you're already there, that's good enough, that's progress, we really miss the point, we miss the opportunity to save people's like emotional discomfort or whatever's happening at that time. It's a shame.
I'm wondering if we might clarify some of that confusion. I'd like to actually get back to your time, your ordination and the training you underwent there, very, very rigorous and intense. But perhaps before that, this agreement on samadhi. And can we define that then? What the benchmark for samadhi is that the right way to think of it? And what the benchmark for jhana is? And what, if not jhana, do you think is going on when people report, say, the soft jhana experiences? I suppose that probably mean anything other than non-dual absorption into the jhana, perhaps. I don't know, maybe you'll tell me. I've heard that. What's going on there if it's not jhana?
Yeah, so if it's really jhana, then we're really speaking about the unbroken awareness of the mind on a mental object. So you can use the word non-dual. It can feel that way because there's no perception of the body and the mind's fully absorbed often in an expanded object, but it's really unbroken awareness. So there's no distraction of thought. You don't know the time, you don't know the body, you don't hear a sound, you're absorbed. for some reason, there's a completely different style of meditation, which is paying attention to the jhana factors. So when you are absorbed, there's certain qualities of mind that are predominant that keep the mind absorbed. They are the Vitaka Vichara Piti Sukha Ekagata. So this is the applied thought, the sustained thought, which isn't really thinking, it's applied and sustained attention. Joy and happiness and one-pointedness, they do the function of keeping the mind therein, so you don't need to try to do it. Now, if our mind is already quite concentrated, mindfulness is well established, maybe we've been focusing on the breath for a while, our mind is starting to focus in. If we put all our attention on joy, the joy is going to feel massive. It's going to feel amazing because we've zoomed in on it. We can flood that joy throughout the body. It'll feel great. You'll love it. When we sustain our attention on joy or on anything, the natural result of sustained attention is that it starts to become more subtle. So that joy will become more subtle. We might feel like happiness is emphasized. When we sustain it a little bit longer, we might feel it becomes even more subtle. People speak about that as being equanimity. Actually, there will still be joy and happiness there at that time, but they're being trained in a way to basically ignore it. And, you know, it's nice to invite joy and happiness into the practice. I'm not saying those practices are harmful or that people shouldn't do them, but it's not the same thing as jhana. And anyone who has practiced both won't have a question about it.
In the jhana method, should we say true jhana, we could say, or the real jhana, by your
I don't want to use a term that puts one down.
Hard jhana?
Yeah, I don't know. We need a different word that isn't jhana for the other one. Because jhana is just jhana, right? They should call it something else, like focusing on the jhana factors or something.
In that, in the jhana that you would teach, maybe that's a way to say it, and that you learned and practiced, one doesn't shift the attention from the object to the jhana factors, as is taught in other jhana methods. The idea as well, focus on, for example, the breath, until there's an arising of jhana factor, usually something like piti or something like that. And then at that time, when it's sufficiently strong, switch to the piti. And then that's your road through jhana, and you just described that. And the way you've been taught, one doesn't take the attention off the initial object. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, the jhana factors just doing their function, but they're not the object of attention.
Does one have a sense of oneself? So, for example, you know, if I sit here and meditate on my breath, I still have a sense of myself meditating on my breath, and, you know, it's there. Of course, in this absorption that you're talking about, does one still have a sense of subject-object of oneself? What's the experience in that?
Yeah, there is, but it's much more subtle. So a lot of the ways that a lot of the things we're usually identified with are absent in a samadhi experience. The whole perception of the body is absent. A lot of our control and volition is absent. But there is still some much more subtle perception of self. So when you're new to samadhi, it feels like a non-self experience because of everything you've put down. But there's still latent perception of self, usually as the knower, as the observer, as the consciousness. And there is still a duality, but again, it's a much more subtle duality. There's the duality of the thing that's knowing, the experience. And that's really why so many of the Buddha's teachings are correcting the wrong views of the sages at the time who had samadhi, because they would take it to be the final goal. And the Buddha was explaining, no, like you still have identity with the five khandhas, even in this stage.
And it takes the application of vipassana to uproot those more subtle levels of delusion. Is that an ignorance? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, for almost all of the people, yes. Yeah, so I believe it's possible maybe if the past life practice is very strong, the natural wisdom is very strong, there's very little craving in the mind, maybe people go up through the jhanas, and then just through inclination to peace, their mind might incline to nibbana. But for most people, we've got latent clinging that needs to be seen with wisdom. And that's really where the vipassana practices come in.
Do you think it's possible to, well, first of all, is jhana, or some facility with samadhi required to practice vipassana effectively in your way of working, or the way of working which you've learned? And also, what can one expect outside of, say, deep retreat? One of the things that has been said about Pa Auk Sayadaw's teaching of jhana is that it is emphasized very often one should be secluded on retreat, because it gets very, very subtle, very, very difficult to maintain the level of the sort of quality of mind required for that sort of a practice in anything other than retreat.
So those are two very different questions. The first one, do you need jhana to practice deep vipassana? The answer in brief is no. But you do need a very deep access concentration to practice vipassana deeply, because you need to go beyond concept. So if you're still being interrupted by thinking, you're still with that conceptual mind. So jhana is super helpful. And usually people that can get to a very deep access concentration, it's not a big jump for them to do the jhana. But I know people that have practiced very deep vipassana without having jhana concentration. So it's possible, maybe not preferable. And then the second question, it's been a big part of my journey as a teacher. When I first came to America with Pa Auk Sayadaw 2013, he was starting up a branch in California, but later it didn't work. But anyway, that summer, some people came and they were practicing, I think it was the white kasina or the light kasina, some type of a jhana practice, lay people. And I remember one of them said to him, how do I practice when I'm in the supermarket, this kasina? Because the kasina is a purely mental object that you're supposed to hold. And I thought, what's he going to say? And he said, don't go to the supermarket. And I just thought that really summarized his worldview. You know, he's been a monk since he was like 8 or 10 years old or something. And now he's in his 80s, like, supermarket? What are you going to do that for? And so it was a big part of the integration I had to do. Actually, I started to do before I disrobed, when I left the monastery and I was traveling more, teaching more, how to maintain the depth of my practice in the world. And it's now something that I also emphasize when I'm teaching. So off of retreats, I make myself available for ongoing instruction by Zoom, and teaching people in their daily lives has like been such a rewarding process for me. And I see it's what people can do. They can maintain the depth of their jhana practice in their daily life.
Oh, you've seen that that's possible?
Yeah, it's possible, and it's common. And it's a skill set that we need to build, you know. It's not just like you go on retreat and you go back home and it's easy. No, we need to build a skill set. We need to build a lot of facility with the 5 hindrances. We need to learn tricks for continual practice. We need to know a lot about our daily rhythm. It forces us to clean out a lot of junk in our relational lives. The things that we need to simplify, they simplify. We need to prioritize it, but it's possible and it's common.
Wow. Would you say it's necessary to go on retreat to learn the jhanas initially? Or is even that something that can be done in day-to-day life, sort of normal working or family life?
I think it's really helpful in general to be on retreat whenever we're practicing at the edge of what our faculties can do. Whenever we're really, at the boundary of our mind's capabilities. It's a bit like a child learning to walk. And when they're wobbly, you put them in a safe environment. But I have some students, it's not the majority, but I definitely know some people just in a daily life practice, they've gone deep in their samadhi. Yeah.
Wow,
they're the ones with very simple lives though. Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah, you offering as well as in-person retreats, sort of online mentoring and all these sorts of things through your site, bethupton.com.
Sorry to it was just such an uncomfortable process. Like after all of these years of like, you know, not me, not mine, and non-selfish humility and none, and with this to like have to brand myself, it was so cringe. And it's still like, oh God, I'm a .com.
You have a .com.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very nice site actually. That was a pandemic project, I understand.
Yeah, it was. I was very, very grateful. Actually, I wouldn't have done it if it wasn't for the support of my students. And until then, if I wanted to like announce a retreat, I didn't even have a mailing list. I'd just try and remember people off of my head and then send out an email. And then I'd forget people and they were like, Beth, you really need to systematize this. And so they garnered this website, and like they helped me through the whole, spoke me through all of the basics, and without them I wouldn't have done it. Sadhu, 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 those people know who they are.
I'm very interested in the curriculum that you undertook at Pa Auk. Your regime there is very intense in terms of practice. I recall you saying somewhere else that you're practicing sometimes, very often actually, 10 to 12 hours a day, having just breakfast and then going and sitting in nature for the whole day, not even meditating with the rest of the community, often just going out to someplace in nature and practicing. That's really quite remarkable. I'm wondering if you could take us through somewhat the curriculum that you undertook there. I mean, the range of meditations you undertook, they're very cool. They're very interesting sounding.
So cool. It's so cool. I'm so pleased you said that, because I mean, a very legitimate criticism of that Pa Auk system is too much detail, right? And that's like coming from Pa Auk Sayadaw's personality. He loves the detail for its own sake. He loves it. And I'm very much of that nature too. I'm like, oh, a new, I don't know, like Kalapa. Oh, we can, like, never mind about liberation. Like, I can just geek out in this detail. And some people hate it. Some people are like, you want me to do it again? I got to see it again. And so these days when I'm teaching, I make a lot of the detail optional, and I try and focus on the bits that people really need. But at that time when I was training, I was so enthusiastic to learn, and it didn't feel intense or rigorous. It was the opposite. My biggest complaint was not enough time to meditate. I could have just done it all day long. I was so happy. And it would take a long time to go through the whole curriculum, but the basic structure is, first of all, developing samadhi. And for most people that will be jhana, but for some people they will practice up to a deep access concentration, and then starting the vipassana practice. And the first level of vipassana in this system, it's based on the vipassana jhanas, is namarupa paricheda jnana, which means defining or discerning materiality and mentality. So we're learning to see materiality and mentality on the level of ultimate reality, which means beyond concept. We're seeing it on the level that it's momentarily coming into and out of existence. If you like, we're familiarizing ourselves with the building blocks of existence. And there's a whole complex training around that, and learning to see these material particles and which are produced by which, and everything. It's fascinating. And then on the level of the mind, we see the mind is made up of individual moments arising and passing away. Each moment is comprised of a bunch of different mental factors. So we're learning to see the different functions of these moments, the mental factors within a moment. And the whole thing is really a practice of breaking down compactness. So where we previously have the delusion of permanence, compactness, solidity, we're breaking it down to see that it's momentarily perishing. Then the second vipassana jnana is pacha parigaha jnana, which is seeing the cause and effect. And because the causes of a lot of these momentary phenomena come from past lives, we practice to see those past life causes as well, which is super interesting as well. And seeing how moments of volition in the past life produce results now, how moments now produce results in a future life. And then once those two foundational vipassana knowledges are there, then we practice in many, many ways from many different angles to deepen our understanding of anicca, dukkha, anatta.
Yeah, that's so amazing. When you're working with those past lives, this is a bit of a muggle question, I'm afraid. But when you say see them, you're of course working at levels of mind that are very subtle and deep, etc. And I mean, I'm familiar just from reading some of the practices to do with the deconstructing of the body and the crystal body and the pile of kalapas and all this sort of thing. I've read about it. Of course, never experienced that myself. But
give it a go.
Perhaps, yeah. But with the past lives, what's the experience of that in terms of the perception? Is it like a memory, like I might remember what I had for dinner last night? Or is it vivid as if you're there? Is it point of view? You're in the view of the past life figure. Is it third person point of view, witnessing a scene, for example? Is it like a dream? Or is it like, well, yeah, what's the experience of that?
It's such a great question. So there are lots of different ways that you can remember your past lives, like hypnosis or drugs or all sorts of things like regression therapy. And also with samadhi is another way. When you remember your past life on the level of concept, even if it's with samadhi, you've always got to take it with a pinch of salt. And the reason is that when you're in those deep states, a samadhi state or a hypnotized state, the mind's very suggestible to different perceptions. In a samadhi state, if you want to see like a purple giraffe with a green hat, like bam, there he is, vivid as day. The mind's very, very malleable to suggestion. So when we see the past lives in this conceptual way, it's very difficult to be sure, is it the real one? Or was there something they're expecting to see that? Very, very difficult to be sure, even if it's with meditation. So when we see on the level of concept, it can be all of those ways you described, as if we're remembering it first person or third person, like a dream, whatever. But when we do it as a vipassana practice, and to my knowledge, it's the only way we can really be sure if it's the true one, we see on the level of ultimate reality. So you can't imagine ultimate reality. The perishing of perception is included in the ultimate reality. So you can't imagine it. You could wrongly discern it, but you can't imagine it. And so what we do, what the instruction is first of all to discern the ultimate materiality now, especially the mind moments. And then you will do some type of an atypical meditation. So it might be like you walk to your meditation cushion, you sit down, you practice the first jhana for 5 minutes, second jhana for 10 minutes, back to the first jhana for 5 minutes, and then stop. And then the instruction will be to see if you can discern the recent past. So can you see the mind moments that were arising in that first jhana? Can you see the mind moments that were arising in the switch from second to first? Can you go back and see the mind moments that were arising in the switch from first to second? Go back further. Can you see the mind moments that saw your meditation cushion? Can you see the mind moments of the touch of your hand when you sat down? Like that, when we get skillful in discerning the recent past, we go back further. And at that time, it's amazing because things come out that you can't remember through your normal memory. Like you might not be able to remember, like, I don't know, the second mouthful of your breakfast last Friday, but you go back and it's amazing. You can catch the nama there. And you go, when you get skillful, you can start jumping. So you go back 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. You see the mind moments when you were a child, when you were a baby, when you're in the mother's womb. And then there's no extra thing. You just go back a bit further and you're in the past life. Like that. And so we see, yeah, it's like, it's a fine balance between experiencing as first person and third person, in the same way that when you discern your mind now, there's this your mind now, and there's the reflective awareness of it. So in the same way, but for the past.
Amazing.
Then to check, you check the causal relationships. So you see, is there a causal link between the mentality that was arising then and the mentality that arises now? You check the karma.
Could you say a little more about that?
Yeah, so moments of volition in the past have a productive effect, and that's really the magic of karma. So a moment that arose in the past and perished, and it no longer exists, not stored anywhere, nothing. It didn't carry over, it doesn't exist anymore. But yet it has a productive power that things now are produced by it. And that's a causal process that we can directly observe. So we will take something that is a karma result in this life, like our ability to see an object is a karma result, and we'll see if we can find its productive cause in this volition that was happening in the past.
Is that a process of inference, or is one able to experience directly the link?
Direct observation. Yeah, direct observation. So I was explaining this to somebody actually, I think it was this morning or yesterday. When we don't yet have skill in directly observing our mental states, it's difficult to imagine how it's possible, because our mental states have no physical characteristics. It's not a feeling in the body. There's no shape or hotness, roughness, nothing. It's a mental state embedded in our consciousness perception. But then we get skillful and we realize these things are directly observable because they have their characteristics. They're not visible, but they've got their discernible characteristics. When we directly observe causal links, it's like one step more subtle than that. It's difficult to imagine how you can directly observe a causal link between something that's perished and something that's produced, but you can. It's the power of samadhi. It's observable by its characteristics.
Very interesting. Another side effect of samadhi that's sometimes discussed and that I've heard you mention, in passing at least, is siddhi. So-called supernatural powers, or at least unusual abilities. That's what maybe it would be a way of saying it.
Yeah.
Could you say something about that? I wonder if, I understand that's something that you did have some experience with. I'm wondering if you could say something about your own experiences with that and its implications.
Yeah, so this is like, I think Pa Auk Sayadaw, very brave, no? When he first started even teaching jhana, it was like controversial. And when he started like teaching the discernment of past lives, controversial. For a long time, he didn't teach any kind of psychic power openly. But in recent years, maybe like because he's old and like past caring, so he started openly teaching psychic powers at Pa Auk, and sometimes even like insisting on it before he lets you do anything else. So there's like a preparatory practice that he teaches called 14 ways. And it's sort of 14 different ways of cultivating the jhanas, with like changing jhanas very quickly and jumping jhanas. And anyway, it's a whole system, and it helps the samadhi go very deep. And then it's based on that he will teach certain psychic powers. So some psychic powers are sort of easier than others for most people. The ones that I've seen him teach the most commonly are the divine eye, which is sort of being able to maybe like see the devas, see the ghosts. If the divine eye is really well established, it's like see what's happening with your samadhi, like on the other side of a wall or something like that. There's this lovely example of Pa Auk, of a monk who developed the divine eye, and he looked directly below him at the earth and the different layers. And then he wrote it down, the color that he thought the different layers of the earth were, and then he got up and dug the hole to check. And then similar to that, the divine ear, which is sort of similar but the sounds, and the remembering of the many, many hundreds of thousands of past lives and different eons. And then there's a more difficult class of psychic powers, which is the things like walking on the water, levitating, the things that's like manipulating the elements, walking through the wall. I never saw anybody at Pa Auk do these things, but I joke sometimes with Pa Auk Sayadaw, like they made him this big lake thing outside of his kuti, and I was like, is that for you to practice walking on? I was just joking, but he's like, shh. I don't know if you can do or not. I can't do.
Could you talk a bit about the process of opening the divine eye and seeing devas and ghosts and so on? When you did that process, I've heard it said that it's important to have an established grounding in, I suppose perhaps by that point it's a bit of an academic question, but in equanimity, because it can be quite frightening to see those sorts of things. I'm wondering what you think of that. Was it frightening for you when you started to see those things, and were you able to switch it off? When it's been opened, does it have to be sustained with samadhi, or is it always open?
Yeah, good question. So I think experiences with devas and ghosts, it comes up for most people way before they develop any psychic power. Yeah, usually there's some awareness of those things with a more rudimentary level of samadhi. Maybe frightening if you don't know what's going on, but we were living in a monastery, so Actually, that's not true. Like some people sometimes frightened by, as for being able to turn it on and off again, I don't think it's what you can turn off. The broader question, I mean, like it sort of sounds like sensational when we talk about these things. There's nothing sensational about it. It's no more sensational than the much more scary creatures in Myanmar, like with the snakes and all of these kinds of things. But the broader question is, as we meditate more, our sensitivity increases. Our sensitivity to reality increases. And I think it's something most meditators feel is like, oh, that's uncomfortable. How can I dull it back down again? And it's important, if we want to go deeper in the Dharma, that we don't dull that sensitivity. Instead, we're being called to raise up our love and our acceptance to match it. Because really the Dharma is calling us to be like fully switched on to reality, to take it all in fully. So when we meet that discomfort of like, this is a bit difficult to accept, it's really calling us to practice more metta, more acceptance.
Is there a reason that it's happened a few times now when I ask you about your own experience? You answer in terms of generalizations, and most people experience this and people experience that. Is that a deliberate device?
It's monastic training, and in which we just don't speak about our own attainments. But I think it's also, it's a helpful guideline laid down by the Buddha. Because we might misunderstand that the purpose of the Dharma is I can do this, I can do that, and really it's the opposite. The purpose of the Dharma is renunciation and the removal of self.
You have said today, if I can do it, you can do it. So there's an implication there. You're bringing your own success as part of the...
To encourage.
Right.
So oftentimes I see, like, if people ask me, what can you do? The intention behind their question isn't for me and how great I am or something like that. They want to know, is it possible? And this is the key message that I want to give. Yes, it's possible. Yes. Yeah, it doesn't matter how skillful I may or may not be in these practices. It is possible. It's what people are practicing. This is what you need to know.
I suppose if you're leading with, I've done it, you can do it too. You do rather invite the question, I think, but also Pa Auk can do it. But so some people would want to know that you had to, and you certainly at least imply it. You certainly say you've done it, and you made a resolution not to leave the monastic training until you'd learn what they taught. And I suppose that you've done is, you say very confidently, freedom from suffering is possible and so on. So I assume that's the attainment that you're, the sort of attainment that you're speaking confidently from your experience. So, is it a case of sort of piecing together what you're willing to say into what you're claiming, or...
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I think, like I said, there's some things, if we claim something as like my achievement, we've really misrepresented what it is. I want to phrase it in terms of these things are possible for people.
Even people like you?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, and because of causes and conditions, like because I met great teachers and because of renunciation, not because of like worldly achievement. It's not that flow.
I suppose to clarify my question, it seems fairly clear what you're claiming by saying anyone can do it. I've done it, you can do it too. It seems like we can infer your accomplishments, at least from what you're willing to confidently assert. It seems somewhat of a long way around.
Yeah, it is a long way around, but like I said, I think those guidelines from the Buddha are helpful, and they're there for a reason. Yeah.
Is it the case that monastics are allowed to discuss their experiences among themselves?
Yes. Yeah, with their teachers, yeah.
But not with the muggles like myself. It's probably for the best.
I don't think it's like that, it's not, the reason isn't secrecy. The reason is that we don't bring self into this realm. The reason is that, we don't bring all of those defilements that can come in, like competing, comparing, pride, those kinds of things. It's not the realm for those things. I want to encourage people, really, like a lot of people don't know these things are possible. I want people to know it's available for them. But these don't arise because, we're so great and look at what I've achieved. It's not like that. They arise out of our willingness to let go of self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. You're maintaining that monastic convention even through that life. Yeah, very
deeply drilled into me, but I respect it as well.
Yeah.
It's got an important function.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing the rationale behind it as well. It's very interesting indeed. One of the things that you teach, which I think is super interesting, maybe we can touch on it, it's a bit specific, is you give different tips in your videos, sort of top tips. And one video in which you're sharing your top tips, your top 3 tips are: build a meditation habit, get clear on what you want meditation to do for you. And then this is the one that I wanted to ask you about. Don't choose an object that's too subtle. Actually, it's 2 parts. Choose an object that you like, and also that isn't too subtle. Could you explain that third point? I think that's something that's not often said. Don't
choose a meditation object that's too subtle. I don't know what more there is to say. Isn't that the answer right there? I don't know what else to say apart from repeat it. Don't choose a meditation object that's too subtle. No, like if we're working with something that's too subtle for us, some teachers out there teaching like one way for everyone, and sort of disregarding where your mind's at on that day or in that sitting. If we practice with a meditation object that's too subtle, the only way to keep our attention with it is to strain. If we make too much effort, we kill our joy, then you've got to make more effort, you end up hating meditation. So don't do that. Choose a meditation object that's comfortable with your attention. Then you'll like meditation, it'll be easy to sustain your attention.
I know you're working now these days with so many students in living householder lives. I'm wondering, do you see what sort of too subtle objects are people using? Or maybe another way of saying it would be, how would one know if one's meditation object was too subtle? Could you give an example? You talk in that video I'm thinking of depending on the state of your mind. If your mind is very active and busy, then something that's too subtle, as you say, you have to strain to reach it. So sometimes you have to take a more coarse object of some sort. And then as your mind gets down to that level, you can go deeper to a more subtle object and sort of track it down like that. And you can't have too much of a disparity between where you're at in your mind and the various objects that might be possible for you later on down the road.
Right.
So I'm wondering what's a sort of common object that you see people straining to reach, that if they could just take a few steps back, they might be able to get there in a more stepwise manner?
Any object. People make that mistake with any object. Whatever meditation subject you're doing, people can get a bit sort of stubborn with themselves maybe, or they think, I've practiced this before, I should be able to practice it now. They try and strain their way back into a level of subtlety they've been previously at. Any meditation object we can do that with, yeah.
I'm wondering, I know you work with a lot of students one-on-one. It's your preferred way of teaching, actually, working one-on-one, customizing to their particular, where they're at.
I really, really dislike giving Dharma talks, and usually I avoid it because I don't know what to say to a whole group of people. They're all different. But here I'm teaching this month at the Forest Refuge, and it's like obligatory. We have to give talks, and it's such a headache. I really hate it. Every week I'm like, oh no, what am I going to talk about? I just got to talk straight for an hour. This crowd, and like they're all wearing masks. You can't even see if they like it. It's really hate it.
Oh dear, what do you talk about in a situation like that? So it's very difficult. That's your thing, isn't it? One-on-one teaching, tracking someone's experience with all that. That's how you were taught, and that's the terrain, and that's your specialty, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, yeah. Just I've described to some people, this month actually has been a very, very, very difficult month for me of teaching, because I'm forced into a format that's not natural for me.
Yep.
And I've just been sort of examining in myself how I usually do and how it's different here. And usually I'm just like, I'm good with the Dharma and I'm open to you. And I don't think about it. Don't think about what I'm going to say next. Don't plan anything, nothing. And if I do group things, I make it Q&A. So like, I'm good with the Dharma. Here's the question. Like, and it's very, very natural for me. But if I'm put into a situation where it's like, what's your structure and how are you going to like, I completely lose the authenticity of what I'm trying to convey.
Mm-hmm. So how have you been getting around that? I'm interested.
No,
I can see the conundrum.
Yeah. I hate it. Yeah. I don't know. I just thought, God, I'm not going to come back here. Last night, I talked about Dharma, actually, like the first few questions that you were asking me earlier today. And we also have a weekly Q&A. So I've been taking my cues from the Q&A, and there were a few questions on the Pa Auk method. So I did another talk about that. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I think we're coming near to an end. I would like to ask you a bit about, or just maybe one question about the sorts of things students come to you for. Of course, someone with your meditative training who's available for private consultation is not massively common, I think. Perhaps I'm wrong about that. You can correct me if I am. But you don't know.
I haven't really researched the field.
Okay. Well, what's the sort of thing that you find people coming to you for? What's, in a sense, do you have an ideal student profile or something like this, or is it anything anyone wants to know about meditation at all?
Whatever comes. Really, I get all sorts. I get people contacting me for like sex advice, and oh, my wife, there's some issue. Like, okay, you do know I was a nun for 10 years. Like, I'm not sure I'm the best person to be answering this. I get quite a lot of people come my way who have had an experience that they can't understand, or they haven't been able to contextualize something that they've experienced. Some people who've been told they've experienced something deep and they can't get back there. They don't know what to do with it. People who have heard about the samadhi practices and want to do those. People who already have samadhi but don't have any way to go deeper in the vipassana practices. Get a lot of people come my way who someone's told them they're enlightened and they want to know if they really are. It's very common. It's like probably a couple of people a week someone's told them they're enlightened.
How do you check that?
In some cases it's obvious that they're mistaken from the way that they describe the experience, and in some cases it's less obvious. There's lots of different some people describe it vague and it's difficult, so in those cases I tell them, it's really important to be sure. It's an important thing. It's really important to be sure. So better practice systematically. If it really is, that experience will return. Better to check like that. Yeah, many, lot of variety, but I like the variety. No, there's no ideal student.
That's very interesting. Speaking of enlightenment, from what I understand, the Visuddhimagga also emphasizes this four-path model: stream enterer, once returner, never returner, to arhat. Does the practice change fundamentally in that method at each of those junctures, past each of those junctures? For example, pre-stream entry is one doing certain practice, and then after stream entry, one does a sort of once returner, direction practice or so. Or is it the same set of techniques that just deepen?
Yeah, no big change, just a deepening of the practice. I don't know what it's like for an arahant to be practicing vipassana. I'd love to find out. Yeah, as our experience of the Dharma deepens, we just do those same practices with more refinement, and like maybe we get better at targeting where our real clinging is. Get like just through life, through practice, we get more familiarity with the habit of our defilements and more skill with challenging them.
Is the view in the method you've been trained that as one progresses through these way stations of awakening, perhaps we could say, or attainments, path attainments, that is it a strict 10-fetter interpretation? In other words, it's the never returner. Have they completely transcended, more or less, hatred and aversion and greed and clinging and that sort of thing, those sorts of fetters? How is that seen in terms of, I suppose, one's experience of craving and aversion and that sort of thing, and the self as one progresses through these different waypoints?
Yeah, so it's definitely the way I was trained, and it's the view that's adhered to in the tradition that I trained in. And I don't know anybody who reached that attainment. So we're in the realm of theory. I don't know anybody who is completely without aversion. I don't think I've ever met such a being. Yeah.
Mm.
Which is sad, you know? It's like a sign of the decline of the Dharma in the world. It's sad. And we've got a lot to be hopeful for still.
Well, thank you for being so generous with your time, Beth. This has been so fascinating. So cool to speak to somebody, a student of Pa Auk Sayadaw, who's had such deep and rigorous training. Really amazing. Is there anything that you'd like to say or that we ought to mention as we're bringing this now to a close?
No, I don't think so. You already mentioned BethUpton.com.
Yeah, BethUpton.com, that's the place. And of course, the note that will be in the show notes, or if you type Beth Upton meditation into Google, you'll find Beth that way as well. Some talks on YouTube and interviews and so on, and you do take students, private students online, and you're teaching all over the world, especially in America at the moment. And yeah, fantastic. Well, Beth Upton, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, you asked really good questions. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.